Boys and girls, welcome to Chapter 21. This is really going to be about World War I down here, the war without stint, all the way society in turmoil. But also at the same time, we're going to finish up with the big stick. This big stick right here. Don't be laughing. Think of this as like a weapon, huge weapon, military, Navy, Army, whatever you want to think of it as. But think of the big stick. America in the World, 1901 to 1907. And that's where we're going to start with today. Roosevelt and his civilization. Roosevelt believed the importance of using American power in the world. The idea of speak softly and carry a big stick was important to him. However, but he had two different standards for using this power. One was for civilized countries and one was for uncivilized nations. Civilized nations he defined as predominantly white, Anglo-Saxon, and uncivilized nations such as were generally non-white, Latin, or Slavic. But racism was only part of the basis of the distinction that he put into this. And he really wanted to keep, let's move on here. He really wanted to keep protecting the open door with Asia because you can see here we had a lot of interest in Latin America and the Caribbean, but we also needed to make sure that we were protecting the open door policy with Japan after the Russo-Japanese War. And really, we just spent, 16 battleships of the new American Navy known as the Great White Fleet, basically just to protect our trade with Asian nations at the time. Again, there's that map. So moving into the iron-fisted neighbor and protecting our own hemisphere and going back to the Monroe Doctrine with the creation of the new Roosevelt Corollary, Roosevelt basically really just said that European intrusions into Latin America could result in not only aggression but also instability or irresponsibility within Latin American nations. And the United States claimed that they had the right to not only oppose European intervention into the Western Hemisphere, but also intervene in domestic affairs of its neighbors if those neighbors proved unable to maintain order and national sovereignty on their own. So if there was issues in Dominican Republic or Canada or wherever, Mexico or Cuba, we were going to go in there and we were going to support them. And going back to the Platt Amendment, go back with Cuba, the United States granted political independence to Cuba in 1902, but only after the new government agreed to the Platt Amendment in its constitution. And the amendment basically gave the United States the right to prevent any other foreign nation or any other foreign power from intruding into the new nation. And in 1906, when domestic uprising seemed threatened the internal stability of the island, American troops landing in Cuba quelled the fighting and remained there for a few years. The Panama Canal, the Panamanian Revolt, really this goes back to Colombia and them not agreeing to the terms that the United States wanted. So the United States looked to Panama to build a canal from basically the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean and it really helped the Panamanian government, but at the same time, it really hurt the Colombian government for the most part. Moving on to Taft and dollar diplomacy. Think of Taft, dollar diplomacy, and moral diplomacy just as, well, dollar as money can buy us through any issue. We will spend tons of American investments in any country. Instead of having to use the military, we'll put money into the issue. And then moral, well, what does moral mean? Wilson's moral diplomacy was more about just protecting American interest in areas versus, again, using the military. So that's really the first part there. And now the road to war, which is happening obviously over in Europe. So Europe was definitely divided into different alliances. The Triple Entente of Great Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. But really Germany and Austria-Hungary were the main two. After the June 1914 assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Serbs, Austria-Hungary invaded Serbia, who called on Russia for help because of alliances with other nations started to enter there. So there was obviously a big web of alliances that went from one country to another. And the United States during this whole time really tried to stay neutral. We didn't really want to be a part of what was happening. So in 1914, Wilson urged neutrality, but many Americans sympathized with certain nations because of their background. They were either German ancestry or Irish ancestry, but most people obviously supported Great Britain and the Allies for the most part. But there were things in the United States that changed, like sauerkraut that you might know of or you might like to eat was really known as Liberty cabbage. Stupid fact of the day. There was a strong United States and Great Britain economic ties, and the blockade of the Central Powers led the United States to continue trade with Great Britain and really shun trades with the Central Powers, and especially Germany. Germany began using submarine warfare in 1915 to combat the Great Britain's naval domination. In 1915, the Germans sank the Lusitania, and in the 1916 Sussex Pledge, Sussex sinking led to Wilson to call on the Germans to recognize the rights of neutrals, who the United States was at the time. We were neutral, and the Germans relented and stopped attacking merchant ships to stop, but the U.S. still was going to be entering the war later on. Moving on here, obviously the election of 1916, and Wilson did not intervene with either side because of the re-election and domestic division. And you can see here how Woodrow Wilson really just won a few states, the major states, to gain re-election in 1916. And the economic and military preparations debated by pacifists and interventionists, and this really became in 1960 a large military armament was already underway of building up our military. And Wilson won an extremely close election because of the association with the ability to keep the United States independent, although the Democrats barely held on to a lot of the congressional majorities in this House. A war for democracy. Sorry, my eyes are burning right now. A war for democracy. After Wilson wanted the country unified and justified to enter the war, we should fight to create new progressive world order and not material gains. And in January 1917, Germany began a huge offensive and continuation of unrestricted submarine warfare to defeat the Allies, and this was finally the U.S.'s entrance into the war. In February, the German telegram urged Mexico to join with Germany, and this also increased a lot of public sentiment towards the war. And the March Russian Revolution toppled the Tsar for a Republican government there. And finally, in April 1917, the United States officially declared war on the side of the Allies, and we were fighting the war to end all wars. And but obviously, that wasn't the case because of World War II. So I'm just going to go through the second part here, War Without a Stint. This is going to be 610, excuse me, all the way up to, I believe, 620. Okay, 612 to 620. So I'm going to go through this with you. Entering the war, immediately the United States entrance with the Allied Navy was able to dramatically reduce the sinking in troops and supply convoys that we were sending over to Europe. In 1917, the withdrawal of the Russian forces after the Bolshevik Revolution, which Lenin led Germans to put resources on the Western Front, and the Allies needed the U.S. ground troops to go there. And now, this was kind of stupid on Germany's part, but they were now fighting a two-front war. One against the Soviets and one against the United States on the western side. The American Expeditionary Force, who was our military, the doughboys, and the U.S. Army was too small to supply the needed troops. And in 1917, Wilson urged the passage of the Selective Service Act to draft troops and soldiers into the American Expeditionary Force. The American Expeditionary Force was diverse. Women served in auxiliary roles, which were non-combat related, and African American soldiers served in segregated units and really just had menial jobs, really digging ditches and other things too. So they weren't really seeing a whole lot of hand-to-hand combat. The military struggle. Oops, let me go back here. I'm gonna pass this. This doesn't really do anything for us about the war. So, technology. There was a lot of new weapons, and tactics were more deadly. First time we've seen tanks, machine guns, and trenches. Dig a hole, get out of the way. We also saw a lot of chemical weapons at this war as well. Logistics and materials transported gained increased in importance, and the rise of the plane and battleships and submarines were also very important. Casualties were extremely high for this war. The British lost 1 million. The Germans lost 2 million. Even the victors overwhelmed by sheer magnitude of death. And another thing about this is last time I checked, there's no World War I veterans alive anymore. They have all passed. So no one we can talk to about it. This map you can see here on page 613. This is just kind of going through the Western Front, where some of the battles were, and you can also see here who the Allied nations were, central powers, and who the neutral nations were. So really, our main enemy here was Germany and Austria-Hungary. All right, organizing the war. Organizing the economy for the war. The U.S. appropriated a $32 billion war. Appropriated $32 billion for the war. Raised money by selling Liberty bonds to public and private companies, and new graduate taxes on income and inheritance also helped support the war effort. To organize the economy, Wilson created the Council of National Defense, but emphasized on Civilian Advisory Commission and tasked to mobilize at the local level. Members urged scientific management, centralization, and proposed dividing the economy based on function and not geography. And war boards recorded an effort in each sector to kind of help with the war. And the War Industries Board, right here, the War Industries Board oversaw the purchase of military supplies under Bernard Bauch, organized factories, set prices, distributed needed materials. Instead of restricting profits, government entered the alliance with the private sector. Now private companies were making a lot of things for the war, and you'll see that even bigger on in World War II. Labor in the war. The National War Labor Board pressured industry for concession of workers' 8-hour workdays, higher living standards, collective bargaining rights, but workers were forced. They were pressured into giving those things up to help support the war. But workers forced to forego strikes. Right before the war, the Ludlow massacre, when striking miners were killed, that was an issue as well. And then finally, stop here. The economic and social results of the war. The Great Migration was huge. People are now traveling to the north. The economic boom definitely happened during the period of European demand. Later, U.S. needed industrial production, expanded opportunities for females to get jobs, minorities, because all the men were at war. And this is also the same time that you will see women in the Women Christian Temperance Union to spread the idea of temperance. The war years saw the great migration of hundreds of thousands of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities like Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago. Southern poverty and racism, and the appeal to get away from Southern poverty and racism, and the appeal of the Northern factory job and freedom led to the movement, and growing black communities near white neighborhoods sometimes resulted in race riots. And women started to take higher paying industrial jobs that were unable to do so in peacetime. So that's just the first part. I'll do more tomorrow. Have a good night.